Police believe that this was some sort of personal dispute. In this shooting, one student is dead, another critically injured. The student who survived this shooting is currently in the hospital, said to be in stable condition. As for the suspect, he is not a student, according to authorities. Authorities arresting Jacob Lee Bard of Evansville, Indiana, charging him with murder and first-degree assault. This all happened Tuesday afternoon on campus near a dorm. All classes have been canceled for the rest of the week as the investigation is still ongoing. But again, police say there is no...
Listen to what you just heard, because it's precisely the blueprint for understanding power in America right now at this exact moment. And the fact that 3 judges have ruled that the Epstein Files Transparency Act requires disclosure of grand jury proceedings and extensive investigative materials tells us something absolutely seismic is happening. But let me be crystal clear about what this actually means. Not what we hope it means or what viral headlines promise, but what the historical record and the structural architecture of American justice actually demonstrate when the curtain gets pulled back even an inch. The judge has already warned us that the grand jury materials likely won't contain bombshells and won't identify anyone besides Epstein and Maxwell, or name any clients, which should tell you everything you need to understand about how meticulously this system has been constructed to protect exactly the people who need protecting. Because the Justice Department memo released in July stated there was no client list and no further disclosure would be made, prompting outcry from both left and right about a cover-up. And that bipartisan fury matters intensely because it reveals something the establishment dreads more than anything else, which is the recognition by ordinary Americans across the political spectrum that the game is rigged not for Republicans or Democrats, but for the ultra-wealthy and connected, full stop. The Epstein case represents the perfect crystallization of what theorists call structural violence, the way institutions themselves become instruments of oppression without anyone needing to explicitly conspire, because the system is designed from the ground up to insulate power from accountability, and we're watching this play out in real time as the DOJ faces a December deadline to turn over files while facing scrutiny over why the Trump administration reversed course on releasing them, with questions about whether mention of Trump's name in files prompted the reversal. Think about the layers of protection here, because this isn't just about one predator, or even one network of predators, but about how American society has constructed entire legal, financial, and social architectures that allow certain human beings to operate with functional immunity, while others get crushed for infinitely lesser transgressions. And when I say crushed, I mean it literally, because the criminal justice system is shaped by economic bias, where crimes unique to the wealthy are ignored or treated lightly, while common crimes of the poor lead to arrest, conviction, and imprisonment. Here's what makes the Epstein Files release so politically explosive, and why progressives need to be leading this conversation with moral clarity and analytical rigor, rather than letting conspiracy theorists or bad faith actors control the narrative. Federal investigators decided not to prosecute Epstein decades ago, after negotiations with his powerful attorneys, and the DOJ has acknowledged that decision reflected poor judgment, allowing him to continue his lifestyle for years, which demonstrates precisely how the system operates to grant second chances, third chances, infinite chances to those with resources, while arrestees who are poor must stay in jail for days, weeks, months, or years until their case resolves. The asymmetry isn't incidental, it's foundational, it's the entire architecture, and understanding this matters because it moves us beyond individual villains to see the structural rot that enables them, and here's where the analysis gets even more damning, because over the last 50 years the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of the rich and powerful, more often than not, systematically dismantling protections and expanding the zone of impunity for elite criminals. Now let's connect this directly to our current political moment, because Epstein ran in elite circles with prominent figures and politicians, and documents made public included names of more than 150 people connected to proceedings related to his network of paying teenage girls and young women to engage in sexual acts, which means we're talking about a bipartisan disgrace, a complete institutional failure that implicates Democrats and Republicans, Wall Street and Silicon Valley, Hollywood and the Beltway. This is what genuine accountability looks like, refusing to let partisan tribalism shield anyone from scrutiny, and progressives should be absolutely uncompromising on this, because our moral authority comes from consistency, from saying loudly that we don't care about your party affiliation or your donor network or your legacy. If you participated in or enabled these crimes, or if you helped bury the evidence, then you need to face consequences, period. And let's talk about those consequences, or rather, their conspicuous absence, because the pattern reveals everything about how American justice actually functions. The Supreme Court held that federal bribery law only prevents paying off officials if payment comes before the desired action, but if payment comes after, it's called a gratuity and is perfectly legal, which is simply legalizing corruption with extra steps, and this dovetails horrifyingly with the Epstein case, because both demonstrate how power protects power through layers of legal insulation, plausible deniability, and institutional gatekeeping. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed for exactly the people it was designed to serve. Elizabeth Warren identified two legal systems, one for the rich and powerful, and one for everyone else, noting it's not equal justice when a kid gets jailed for stealing a car while a CEO gets raises when his company steals billions. Here's where we need to hammer home the class analysis, because this isn't abstract theory. It's playing out in material reality every single day. White-collar cases have dropped to a 20-year low, and associated fines have gone down by 90%, while simultaneously the United States imprisons more of its citizens than any other nation, with only 5% of the world's population yet nearly 25% of all prisoners. The juxtaposition is obscene, it's morally indefensible, and it represents a deliberate policy choice by elites of both parties to criminalize poverty while decriminalizing plutocracy. Think about the resources devoted to prosecuting someone with a tiny amount of drugs versus the resources devoted to prosecuting someone who defrauded thousands of people out of millions of dollars. The disparity isn't accidental, but reflects whose lives matter to the people who control the levers of state power. The Epstein case forces us to confront something deeply uncomfortable about American democracy, which is that the concept of equality before the law is largely mythological for anyone paying attention to actual outcomes. Trump administration officials talked about how the Epstein client list speaks to the enormous problem of a connected class of insiders who feel they can get away with anything because they can. And that assessment is absolutely correct, even though it comes from figures who themselves embody that corruption. And this is the twisted irony of our moment, that even the corrupt can accurately diagnose corruption when it serves their political interests. But here's what should enrage every progressive watching this unfold. The Justice Department declared in July that there was no client list and no further disclosure would be made, a transparently absurd claim that insults our intelligence and demonstrates the ongoing institutional commitment to protecting powerful predators. Let's examine the mechanics of this protection racket, because understanding how it works is essential to dismantling it. The initial Epstein probe resulted in a controversial plea deal, allowing him to avoid federal prosecution by pleading guilty to state charges and serving just over a year in a work release program, which represents perhaps the most grotesque example of two-tiered justice in modern American history. A man credibly accused of trafficking and abusing dozens of minors getting what amounts to a timeout. The prosecutor who engineered that sweetheart deal later became labor secretary. Because in America, enabling elite criminality doesn't tank your career, it enhances it. It marks you as a team player who understands how the game works, and won't rock the boat by doing something radical like enforcing the law equally. And this pattern repeats across every institution, the revolving door between corporate law firms defending white-collar criminals and the Justice Department supposedly prosecuting them, the way regulatory agencies get captured by the industries they regulate, the way politicians depend on wealthy donors whose interests directly conflict with justice for ordinary people. Now here's where the analysis needs to get even sharper, because we're not just talking about individual corruption, but systemic corruption. Even as today's corruption makes the scandals of the 1970s seem quaint, the electorate seems inured to the dominance of money politics, whereas Watergate prompted major campaign finance reforms. We've been conditioned to accept as normal what previous generations would have considered intolerable, and that normalization is itself a political project, a decades-long campaign to make us cynical and disengaged, and convinced that nothing can change. But the fury over the Epstein files proves that beneath the learned helplessness, there's still rage at injustice, still a burning desire for accountability, and progressives need to tap into that and channel it toward structural transformation, rather than letting it dissipate into conspiracism or partisan mudslinging. The documents being released are important, not primarily for what names they contain, but for what they reveal about institutional failure at every level. The judge slapped prosecutors for not giving notice to victims before asking that materials be made public, noting the DOJ has not treated victims with the solicitude they deserve, which is a polite judicial way of saying the government cares more about managing public relations and protecting powerful defendants than about the human beings who were trafficked and abused. The victims in this case, like victims of elite crimes generally, are afterthoughts, their trauma secondary to the reputational concerns of billionaires and politicians, and celebrities who might be embarrassed by revelation of their associations. This is what structural violence looks like, the way institutions routinely prioritize the comfort of the powerful over the dignity and rights of the vulnerable. And let's be absolutely clear about the bipartisan nature of this rot, because documents include names of former presidents and British royalty, with Clinton having flown on Epstein's planes numerous times, and Maxwell denying he visited Epstein's island, while a former Epstein employee testified about having dinner with Trump at Epstein's Palm Beach home and meeting Clinton on Epstein's plane. These associations don't prove criminality, but they demand investigation. They demand transparency. They demand answers about what these powerful men knew, and when they knew it, and why they continued associating with a known predator. The progressive position here should be maximalist transparency regardless of whose ox gets gored, because anything less than full accountability perpetuates the system of elite impunity that enables future Epsteins. Here's what makes this moment so politically potent and dangerous for the establishment. An ever larger majority of Americans are angry at the status quo and open to anti-system politics, and the Epstein case perfectly embodies why that anger is rational and justified. People understand viscerally, even if they can't articulate it in theoretical terms, that there are different rules for different classes of people, that the system is fundamentally rigged, that the institutions claiming to dispense justice are actually protecting the guilty. This recognition cuts across traditional partisan divides and creates an opening for transformative politics, but also for demagoguery and fascism, which is why it's so crucial that progressives offer a coherent critique and a path forward rather than ceding the terrain to bad faith actors who will weaponize justified rage for authoritarian ends. The structural analysis here is crucial because the base of unequal justice is the unequal distribution of wealth and income, and a criminal justice system cannot hold individuals guilty of breaking the law if the law itself supports and defends an unjust social order. The Epstein case isn't separate from our economic system, but an expression of it, the logical endpoint of treating human beings as commodities, and allowing the ultra-wealthy to purchase not just luxury goods but immunity from consequences. When you can buy your way out of a jail cell, when you can hire a legal dream team that costs more than most people make in a lifetime, when prosecutors and judges defer to wealth and status, then justice becomes just another product available only to those who can afford it. And we have two justice systems where for hundreds of thousands of arrestees, the difference between freedom and jail depends solely on wealth status, which means that the fundamental promise of equal justice under law is a lie, a marketing slogan that conceals a deeply stratified reality. Let's talk about what genuine accountability would actually require, because vague calls for justice aren't sufficient. We need concrete demands, and we need to understand why those demands face such fierce resistance. First, steps must be taken toward criminalization of white-collar crimes, creation of a correctional system that promotes human dignity, more reasonable exercise of power by authorities, and equal access to high-quality legal expertise. But beyond that, we need to confront the reality that the Supreme Court's conservative majority does as much as possible to allow corruption by the wealthy and powerful, while accepting lavish gifts from people who benefit most from their decisions, which means court reform isn't a peripheral issue, but central to any project of democratic restoration. We need ethics enforcement with teeth. We need to end lifetime appointments for unelected judges who consistently rule for the powerful against everyone else. We need to recognize that the judicial system as currently constituted is an obstacle to justice rather than its guarantor. The Trump administration's handling of these files tells us everything we need to know about elite priorities across partisan lines. Early in Trump's second administration, the release seemed imminent when Attorney General Bondi distributed binders labeled the Epstein Files Phase 1, but then the Justice Department declared there was no client list and no further disclosure would be made. A bait-and-switch that should surprise absolutely no one, because protecting elite criminals is bipartisan work. The fact that the Transparency Act mandates release by December 19th could shed light on why the administration reversed course, suggests that whatever is in those files is explosive enough that people in power actively don't want it public despite earlier promises, and that should tell us everything about whose interests are being protected. Here's where the progressive critique needs to become a progressive program, because identifying the problem isn't enough, we need structural solutions. Bipartisan legislation would close the loophole, allowing public officials to receive bribes as tips for official actions after the fact, with legislators noting the Supreme Court effectively legalized bribery. And while that's a necessary reform, it's also a band-aid on a gunshot wound. We need comprehensive campaign finance reform that eliminates the financial dependence of politicians on wealthy donors. We need to break up monopolies and oligopolies that concentrate economic power, which then translates to political power. We need progressive taxation that actually redistributes wealth rather than allowing billionaire accumulation. We need independent oversight bodies with adequate powers to monitor, investigate, and enforce compliance, with teeth sharp enough to actually hold the powerful accountable rather than slapping wrists. The horror of the Epstein case is that federal prosecutors say he operated an underage sex trafficking ring for decades, identifying and exploiting dozens of vulnerable girls beginning around 1994. And during all that time he was protected by wealth, by connections, by prosecutors who gave him deals, by a system that values the comfort of predators over the safety of children. Every institution failed, law enforcement failed, the judicial system failed, the media failed, until finally they didn't. The political class failed, and they failed because they were working as designed for the people they're designed to serve. He might have gotten away with all of it, except the Miami Herald published an exposé and fought for 5 years in court to have documents made public, which tells us that accountability when it comes is usually the result of dogged journalism and activism rather than institutions functioning properly. This brings us to the crucial question of what ordinary people can do, because the system isn't going to reform itself. Power doesn't voluntarily relinquish power, and Democrats need to radically reform themselves if they want to defeat the radical right, realizing non-college educated voters need to be won over, and that promised returns to bipartisan comedy is just ancien regime restoration, becoming a party willing to embrace radical policies to change the status quo. The Epstein files should be a catalyst for a broader reckoning with elite impunity and structural corruption, connecting the dots between sex trafficking and financial fraud, between tax evasion and environmental destruction, between wage theft and union busting, because all of these represent the same underlying reality of a system organized to protect wealth and power at everyone else's expense. The documents being released now under court order demonstrate what's possible when transparency is forced rather than voluntary. The Transparency Act specifically mandates release with limited exceptions, stating that potential embarrassment of public officials is not grounds for withholding documents, which is exactly the principle we need applied across government and corporate institutions. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, but only if we demand it. Only if we make it politically untenable for officials to hide behind classification and privilege and trade secrets and all the other mechanisms by which power shields itself from scrutiny. The Epstein case proves that the files exist, the evidence exists, the receipts exist, they're just locked away in vaults protected by institutions that serve power rather than justice. Think about the implications of the Justice Department saying they conducted an exhaustive review and no other people would be charged and no additional material would be released, which sparked tremendous public backlash including from Trump supporters because officials had vowed transparency. That backlash matters, that fury matters, because it demonstrates that there's a constituency for accountability that crosses party lines, and progressives should be building coalitions around anti-corruption and elite accountability rather than ceding that ground to right-wing populists who talk a good game but deliver plutocracy. The demand should be simple and uncompromising: release everything, investigate everyone, hold people accountable regardless of their wealth or status or political connections, and if that means embarrassing presidents and princes and CEOs, then so be it, because their embarrassment matters infinitely less than justice for victims and prevention of future crimes. The story we're watching unfold is about whether America will finally reckon with the reality that we have a two-tiered system in which those in the upper echelons of political and financial power are virtually immune from prosecution, while the poor and powerless are imprisoned with alacrity, or whether we'll continue pretending that equal justice is real while evidence of its absence accumulates. The Epstein files are one thread, but pulling on it reveals the entire rotten tapestry: the way institutions interlock to protect power, the revolving doors and the old boy networks, and the quiet phone calls that make problems disappear for people who matter, while destroying lives of people who don't. And the choice before us is whether we're going to demand structural transformation or accept managed decline into explicit oligarchy. Every day these files remain sealed or redacted or incomplete is another day that justice is delayed and therefore denied. Another day that victims are told their trauma matters less than protecting powerful men's reputations. Another day that ordinary people learn the lesson that the system is rigged and there's no point fighting it. But Congress passed a law ordering the Justice Department to release all records related to Epstein, which proves that organized pressure can force institutional action even when institutions resist. And that should inspire continued mobilization around not just this case but the broader project of democratizing justice and dismantling elite impunity. This is the work. This is what progressive politics means in practice, using every available tool to drag truth into the light and demanding consequences for those who've operated in darkness. The files are coming, the truth is coming, and when it arrives we need to be ready, not just to consume the revelations like entertainment, but to demand systemic change, to connect individual criminality to structural rot, to build coalitions demanding accountability and transformation. The Epstein case should radicalize people about the nature of power in America, about who it serves and who it crushes, about the distance between our democratic mythology and our oligarchic reality. 3 judges have now said these documents must be released, and that's not the end of the story, but the beginning, the moment when we find out whether we're a country capable of holding the powerful accountable, or whether we're going to keep pretending that justice is blind while watching it protect predators and punish victims. And progressives need to lead this fight with moral clarity and strategic vision, because the alternative is letting bad faith actors weaponize legitimate fury for authoritarian ends, and we cannot let that happen, not now, not ever, not while there's still a chance to build something better from the rubble of institutions that have failed us.